Thank you, Susan. And I do want to thank Susan Derwin, Director of the IHC, and the very hardworking staff of the IHC for making this roundtable possible. It takes a very special context to allow us to talk across departments and divisions, and the IHC offers that unique context. So, let me start things off with a giant claim. And then over the next hour and a half, we can figure out how to modify it or back away from it altogether. Here goes. We now know what nature is worth. Sort of. In the last 2 decades, incredibly hardworking teams of scientists, including some affiliated with UCSB's National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and others on UN projects like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the MEA, which I'll come back to in a moment, have undertaken the unimaginably complex project of calculating the value of the vast range of benefits humans receive from ecosystems around the world. In 2011, revisiting work that first appeared in 1997, Robert Costanza and his colleagues put the value of global ecosystem services at $125 trillion per year, a figure significantly larger than global GDP. Of course, such studies acknowledge that there's a huge margin of error, potentially. Value factors shift over time as humans change the way they use natural resources, but we do now have this number. So one compelling question is, why do we need it? What good does that number do us? These projects argue that knowing the value of the work contributed to a process by an ecosystem is crucial to arriving at an accurate understanding of what our projects and plans cost. All too often, the services supplied by ecosystems say how coastal wetlands mitigate storm-caused erosion, or how an intact forest stores CO2. All too often, those services remain invisible in the kind of cost-benefit analyses we work with. Putting a price on what had been taken for granted, left out of the accounting, and almost always not paid for, means that we can identify and discuss the actual value of natural resources and ecosystems to human well-being. From there, their values and their replacement costs can be factored into international policy discussions and can be entered on the balance sheets of multinational corporations. If you spend much time reading what we might call the para-literature of environmental policy work, white papers, position papers, project reports, I'll bet there are many people in the room who do this, you already know how pervasive economic metaphors have become in this context. Often suggesting risky fiscal behavior, they appear as titles and they enliven subheadings. So in the 2005 Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report called Living Beyond Our Means, subheads in the report include running down the account, the bottom line, and spending the capital. You know that's not good. In short, natural capital is now the go-to framework in many sectors for discussions of sustainable development, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. When I first came across this phrase, I understood it to be constructed as a deliberate oxymoron, a figure of speech that juxtaposes two incommensurate concepts to highlight their disjunctiveness. I've learned better. In fact, it seemed to me to be an almost perfect emblem of the paradoxes of the Anthropocene itself, in which human actions are not only inextricably and irreversibly entangled with global-scale geological processes, but actually shaping and driving them. But I want to keep in mind that first and foremost, natural capital is a figure of speech, a metaphorical construction. As Maria Akerman argues in an article entitled, "What Does Natural Capital Do? The Role of Metaphor in Economic Understandings of the Environment," it's a very powerful figure of speech. Akerman writes, "Natural capital is a polysemic metaphor. It is analytically weak, but it is metaphorically strong and heuristically powerful. Thus it performs different work for different groups in diverse contexts, circulating and acting in the world with different effects." Without necessarily being aware of these nuances, popular environmental literature and media are embracing the concept of natural capital, suggesting that within our discourses and in the institutions that form in relation to those discourses, nature is gradually but definitively being reframed as natural capital. So nature is becoming natural capital. In popular green writing, natural capital now seems to merge seamlessly with finance capital. Sean Sullivan, in an essay, The Natural Capital Myth, cites an example written by Tony Juniper, a former director of Friends of the Earth. Juniper's title is, "What Has Nature Ever Done for Us?" Or, "How Money Really Does Grow on Trees." The foreword to the book is written by Prince Charles, and it defines natural capital as a set of economic assets which can produce dividends that flow from these assets indefinitely. As Sullivan further points out, this definition of nature as natural capital is also becoming synonymous with notions of environmental care. As in the reports I cited earlier, Tony Juniper calls for reform by warning that we've been treating our natural capital like a planetary Ponzi scheme. So what is the problem here? Why not exploit the heuristically powerful effect of the metaphor to get people to take notice and to take action? The response may seem banal, but I urge that we consider it seriously. When ecosystems and natural resources are consistently and pervasively framed by the language of calculation and speculation associated with financial practices, we may be at risk of no longer being able to think outside these discourses. If it comes to seem second nature to us to speak of nature in terms of a growth-oriented economic framework, nature as a capital asset that can generate dividends and can be managed to perhaps maximize those dividends, then it will be natural to assume that our job is to account for, to materialize, and indeed to maximize those dividends. So today's roundtable will let us take a closer look at the provenance and implications of this now nearly ubiquitous concept. So I'm very grateful to our panelists who come from a variety of disciplines and fields spread across the campus from here to that cliff edge that the Bren School overlooks, and I'm going to introduce them to you now. Peter S. Alagona is an associate professor of history, geography, and environmental studies here at UCSB. His research focuses on the histories of land use, natural resource management, environmental politics, and ecological science in the North American West and beyond. He is the author of After the Grizzly, Endangered Species and the Politics of Place in California, published in 2013 by University of California Press. And Sarah Anderson is an associate professor at the Bren School, affiliated with the Department of Political Science. She has three main research agendas: the role of political parties in influencing policy outcomes, the effect of bureaucratic delegation on policy implementation, and the mobilization of the public for environmental action. She's worked as a legislative assistant in Congress and briefed the House Subcommittee on National Parks and Public Lands. The two projects that most excite her now are one on wildfire and one on how moral language mobilizes people, but also makes compromise more difficult. And Ken Hiltner is a professor at UC Santa Barbara, where he holds appointments in both the English and environmental studies.
By the way, how do we know which person you're mentioning?
I'm sorry. So,
I'm definitely Sarah.
Sarah Anderson, now Ken Hiltner. Ken holds appointments in both the English and Environmental Studies Department. In 2012-13, he taught at Princeton University as the Curry C. and Thomas A. Barron Visiting Professor in the Environment and Humanities. He's written 5 books and numerous articles engaging with the environmental humanities, and is currently the director of UCSB's Environmental Humanities Center. Our next panelist in alphabetical order, Sharon Main, is not able to be with us today because she's at a county-wide meeting on food politics and food alliances in Santa Barbara, so she wasn't able to make it out to campus today after that event. So I'll move on to Richard Wittick, the author of a wonderful book, Trouble in the Forest, California's Redwood Timber Wars, from University of Minnesota Press, 2009, and ethnography, cultural analysis, and social history of U.S. colonization and industrialization of California's northern redwood region. In new research aimed at further integrating global studies and cultural sociology with media and environmental theory, Richard scales up his institutional analysis of US culture to the international scene of UN climate negotiations. He's conducted field work at the annual conferences of the parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where he's represented the University of California as an official UN observer delegate with collaborator John Foran of sociology for the past 4 years, so that would be COP 17, 18, 19, and 20.
Correct.
He's a member of the Orphelia Center's Transnational Politics and Social Movements of Climate Justice Research Cluster. Here are our panelists. Thank you very much again. So let me say a word about format. Because this is a very pluridisciplinary lineup, we haven't circulated white papers in advance. We didn't share glossaries or acronym sheets. So I've asked each speaker to offer a brief statement of how the concept of natural capital operates in their field and how these, how the concept has become interesting to them. We can get a handle that way on what I call the polysemicity of the phrase. After that, we will turn to some specific questions that I've prepared panelists to answer, questions panelists may have for each other, and then open up to audience questions. So I'm really looking forward to a wonderful discussion. I thank everyone for coming, and I thank the panelists again. So let's roll out in alphabetical order, and that would be Peter S. Alagrona.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. By the way, do you go by E?
I do go by E.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's something new here.
Would you move the microphone?
Oh, great.
The microphone, thanks.
So, thank you, E.
Kiss the microphone. Closer, closer, closer.
Should I actually kiss it?
Well, we're talking about that here. Even closer. Yes, yes.
All right. So, thanks everybody for coming. This is a great showing, and I'm really happy to be here. And thank you for the invitation. It's going to be a fun session. So, what I thought I'd do is talk about this from two different angles. One from the field in which I'm trained and where I find my home, and the other from the perspective of the field as a historian I study, which is conservation biology. So I'm an environmental historian and historian of science by training, and my work is often focused on the role of science and society, particularly with respect to conservation biology. So first I'll talk about the history part, and then I'll talk a little bit about the conservation biology part. So historians are aware that there's a very long lineage, a long story, a long history of talking about and arguing that nature provides beneficial services to people, often for free, that we should manage wisely. And this discussion goes back quite a long way, at least into the 19th century and probably before. And you can see this in historical documents from the late 19th and early 20th centuries in fields like economic ornithology and entomology, where there were specific studies going on looking at the ways in which different kinds of species contributed to the production of agriculture, for example, in places like the American West. There's a long history of talking about this in different kinds of ways. By the mid-20th century, key theme in this story, I think, of course, prehistory, key theme is the emergence of cost-benefit analysis, which again is another way of trying to find values in nature, trying to compare them in terms of trade-offs for certain kinds of projects, for example, like big water projects. So the Army Corps of Engineers is very much associated with the history of cost-benefit analysis as a method, as a way of valuing, or someone say devaluing often nature, and use this explicitly in approaches, for example, when it proposed to do things like dam the Grand Canyon. Now, of course, environmental and other groups often complained that the cost-benefit approaches that were being used in agencies like the Army Corps failed to factor in the full value of the kinds of services that nature was providing, and so this was a debate that occurred in a variety of different ways during the mid-20th century. By the 1970s, this discourse, although not really called ecosystem services and natural capital at this point, but a similar kind of discourse emerged around the discussion of the limits to growth, and then it became really a subject of economic inquiry, explicit economic inquiry in the 1990s. Leading up, of course, to the publication of that famous Costanza et al. Paper in 1998, entitled, modestly, The Value of the World's Ecosystem Services and Natural Capital, period. That paper found that the value of the world's ecosystem services and natural capital was, on average, varied considerably, but was on average about $33 trillion per year for services versus the global gross national product at that time of around 18 trillion per year, basically saying that we couldn't afford to replace the services if we lost them, no matter how much we tried. So this is followed by a series of attempts in the early 2000s to try to better theorize this and to try to apply it, right? And so that kind of brings us to where we are now. And on the one hand, this emergence of a natural capital framework with an idea of ecosystem services at its core that we now have and that we're now familiar with in the way you talked about, reflects an attempt to move away from the classical economic view of infinite substitutability or fungibility of resources. So the essential idea here in some ways, which people often miss, it's kind of buried in this, is the idea that resources aren't, okay, got better. Should I start again? Absolutely not. Okay, so the idea that resources are not infinitely substitutable or fungible. If you lose certain things, you truly lose them, and it may be very hard, or at least impractical, to pay for them. On the other hand, however, the natural capital model accepted the fungibility of money, right, as a means for placing value on most things in nature, and as a means of enrolling ecosystem services into a system of more rational economic use. And so this kind of brings us to this kind of fundamental underlying philosophical point that was brought out quite well by the philosopher Michael Sandel and others. Sandel has argued sort of famously now that we've moved from a market economy, a society with a market economy, to a market society, where we are on some level willing to assume that everything falls within the reach of economics and can be considered and valued in terms of money. Now, let me switch and talk about a little bit about conservation biology now. And this is an interesting case. So conservation biology is the field that seeks to preserve the biodiversity, the diversity of life on Earth through a variety of different means. And this debate has unfolded really differently in conservation biology over the years. Initially, at the dawn of the conservation movement in the US, conservationists, scientific conservationists, as I said, talked a lot about ecosystem services, right? And they talked about it in a variety of different ways. They talked about it in terms of the values, the actual monetary values that ecosystems provided, but they also talked about the intrinsic value of nature, right? And so they flip-flopped back and forth in a way, and oftentimes they did so in a politically savvy manner, depending on which kind of audience they were talking to. And this is really in the records from that early period of conservation, let's say in the early 20th century. Now, fast forward to the 1970s and 80s when the contemporary version of conservation biology really emerged and coalesced into a field and a movement. And the leaders in that field at the time really articulated a view of value of nature that really focused primarily on intrinsic value. They had a small army of philosophers at their back, and at the time, this actually wasn't really pie-in-the-sky sort of stuff. The U.S. Endangered Species Act of 1973, for example, sought to preserve all native species and ecosystems, ecosystems of which they're a part, and it explicitly, the ESA, 1973, explicitly prevented the use of economic factors in decisions about whether or not to list a species as threatened or endangered, even though that listing could have considerable economic consequences. Now fast forward again to very close to the present, and over the past several years, as that founding generation of conservation biologists have started to retire, to age, to fade from the scene, a new generation, a new cohort of conservation biologists has started to advocate for a much more ecosystem services based approach. And when asked why, their answer is simple. The conservation of the past 40 years hasn't worked. That's what they say, right? And so there are some very charismatic folks behind this new approach, and it's generated considerable controversy, and as you can imagine, considerable backlash from the folks who were the initial founders of conservation biology who are now in the twilight of their careers. This dispute has spilled over into the public in a very visible way, I guess you could say. There have been articles about it, not only in journals like Conservation Biology, but also in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and even in the New Yorker. Believe that. So what does this all mean? So I think that history can tell us a couple things about this current debate in conservation biology, so I'm going to bring these together a little bit. The first may be that the current dispute, although sort of spectacular in some ways, is a new dispute, in the form that it's taking now, but the underlying argument about how to value nature and whether it should be explicitly described in monetary terms is quite old and on some level really unresolvable. So it promises not only to have been with us, but to be with us for a long time in the future. The second is that in the history of conservation, new approaches don't necessarily supplant old ones. New approaches tend to accrete or get layered on top of one another. So the conservation biology of the future, if we want to use the past as a model, which is a little bit dangerous, but we can maybe speculate a little bit here, will probably include more traditional approaches, like setting aside nature reserves that have been at the core of conservation biology for many decades. But it'll also include novel approaches, such as assigning prices to ecosystem services like pollination as a way to try to get and maintain biological diversity. And so this means that in the future, people will probably be talking about both intrinsic value and monetized ecosystem services as rationales for conservation, which as a historian, I have to say, sounds a lot like what people were talking about 100 years ago.
Thank you. Really close to me. Good afternoon. I'm really glad to be here, particularly because I think we just need to foster this kind of dialogue across campus. I am fairly certain I have never heard the word metaphor at Brent. I don't think that ever comes up in any circumstances. So it's fun for me, and it's a stretch, and that's fun. And it's just this is such a great place to think about environmental problems too. So I really appreciate these efforts and the IHC for having me here, and everybody else for being here to talk to. So I'm a little bit, I think, like Peter, I'm gonna wear two hats today. On the one hand, I'm going to wear the hat that says, like, this idea of natural capital is just really practical, and it's useful, and it works really well in certain circumstances, right? If you're trying to compare one alternative to another alternative, it's really handy to translate them both into dollars. Just makes everything easier, right? So from a conservation planning perspective, or if you're a conservation biologist and you're trying to think about alternatives, or if you're trying to think about something under NEPA, what are the environmental consequences, it just turns out to be really handy to put it into these terms. Right? And then the other reason is that if one of my economist colleagues are sitting up here, you know, he would say that incentives matter, right? And that people really respond to prices, right? So we talk about putting a price on carbon, that's sort of, you know, the same idea. And people really, we know, would respond to that, they do, right? So it's not just sort of practical and handy, it's effective, right? And to the extent that this gets used for that kind of a situation, so putting a price on what a developer has to pay if they're going to do something to a wetland or do something to another resource that we value, makes them respond, right? In a way that just saying, well, we don't really think you should do it, and we think maybe you should give us something in exchange, but we don't have really any capacity to decide what that is. That's handy, and that works, right? It makes people pay attention, and it makes them behave differently. And so in that sense, I think it's really a useful, a practical, a valuable concept. And I guess in that context, it's not just a metaphor, right? It's a tool. And I think it loses a lot of its sort of normative sense when you think about it as a tool, and as one of the many tools that we might have in conservation. But then I realized that I wasn't actually an economist, I'm actually a political scientist. And so I started to think about it in terms of what motivates people, and in particular how interest groups motivate people. So how organizations try to get involved in politics to change status quo, right, to get policy. And there, I'm not so sure it matters quite as much, is what I came down to. I started to think about what it might mean for how people sort of engage on a day-to-day basis, and you know, sort of had a question, right? And so we know that people are motivated by a lot of other things than dollars, right? So, for example, I have this project on moral politics and how does moral language motivate people, right? And that's just a whole different ballgame. It has nothing to do with natural capital, and you don't even have to talk in dollars, and you can get people to do things, right? You can get people to get organized, you can get them to show up, you can get them really mobilized. And we also know that they also are sometimes really actually bad at making decisions around money and risk and probability and, you know, all the ways that we would love to like calculate this out and just have an answer. We know that people, individuals, aren't really great at that, right? They way overestimate the downside of things. They tend to kind of undervalue the upside. You know, they're just not very good at that. So even if we could come up with an answer, it's sort of not clear that that would be all that useful. And then finally, I think all the organizations around mobilization, around getting people interested in taking action to conserve or taking action to reduce carbon, have other reasons than costs and benefits to mobilize, and in fact do mobilize around lots of other things. So the example that immediately came to mind was Keystone XL, because it's in the news right now. I, in fact, actually thought the bill was called the Keystone Jobs Bill. It's not. I looked it up. It's called the Keystone Pipeline Bill, I think. But, you know, politicians have been talking about this, and so I started to think about it. And, you know, it's one of those things we can quantify on both sides of it, right? There's a really nice little white paper. It's like 3 pages long, and it sort of quantifies both sides of this problem. It talks about 42,000 annual temporary jobs and a few permanent jobs. And then what do those do for the economy, directly and indirectly? And it talks about ecosystem services and what, you know, the possible risks are and what the consequences could be. And that's essentially not what we're talking about. We're talking about jobs, but the bottom line is it's very few jobs, and yet we're still talking about that, right? And that's because that's useful to organizations in this system to talk about jobs. And we're talking about risks, but we're not talking about them in natural capital terms, really, right? Keystone became a really, really useful organizing tool if you're interested in reducing carbon, right? And it got connected to a bigger, broader debate, and it was really useful in that sense. But it sort of wasn't used in this way. And so that got me, because I'm sort of interested in this question of framing and what motivates people, and you could think about natural capital as just one way of framing the debate, right? One way of connecting to you and all the things that you naturally think about, mobilizing those and getting you interested. It made me think that yes, natural capital is sort of one of those frames, and it comes in handy regularly, I think. But it also is just one of so many different ways of thinking about it. And that there are so many organizations out there who have incentives and reasons to think and to talk about things other than natural capital, that I think it becomes just one among those many in some sense. So I think, Peter, you kind of came down to that too in a way. So we're both wearing two hats and coming down to this sort of, it's important. And it definitely gets used, but it gets used in the way Tool gets used and in the way that there are other tools in that box, I think.
Close enough to the mic?
We'll see.
Great. So I want to wear two hats today. I can't do that. So I'm a literary historian, and what I want to do, I guess, the one hat will be going back and looking at sort of the early modern emergence of this idea, what we think of as sort of natural capital, where it came from. And in a way, it's sort of going to set up Peter's sort of, you know, disruption of that in the 19th century, probably before that happens, and kind of his own work with the two. So hopefully this will make sense when I go along. But my second hat will be coming into the 20th century and arguing why the idea of natural capital might be a little disagreeable to some folks, why there may be a knee-jerk, actually environmental response to it that's not positive. And it's actually going to come from my side of the fence, which are the humanities. So hopefully this will make sense. First, capital, in a modern sense, is not that old of a term. We're used to it, you know, with Marx and Engels and Adam Smith and all. But before that, really the term was property. And property existed for the most part when it was theorized as an economic thing, rights of property, who owned it, how you negotiated this legally and all that. The relationship, however, to the property that you own, to natural capital, was not really well theorized for quite a while. But one of, I think, a milestone event that happened was in 1690, John Locke wrote this work. You may have heard of it, Second Treatise of Civil Government. It's a great work. And in it, he puts the value on the natural capital. And that value is, and this goes to E's question of its worth, goes to this issue of why it's an oxymoron. Locke is very clear, it's worthless. It's completely worthless. The natural capital only gets its value when we do something with it. Its intrinsic value is pretty much nothing. This lasts for a long time, by the way, and this is where there's a major sort of backlash to this in the 19th century. But just to give, to flesh this out as to why it's not a wacky idea, think of something like oil. Why does oil have any value at all? And you can actually find this out yourself if you walk along the beaches here at Santa Barbara and Goleta. Sometimes, and I take my dog to Henry's Beach a lot, you'll step into this tarry stuff that's bad, impossible to get off your feet, and thoroughly impossible to get off a dog's paw. That's oil. So what happens is, why we have the channel out here with those oil derricks there is because there's natural oil, has nothing to do with, spills or anything, coming up out of the ground, floats up to the top of the ocean, because oil is lighter than water, comes into the coast and we step on it. Why does that have any value? It just doesn't. It's only when we think of ways of making this have value that it has it. Locke says that's the case with everything. It is generally, pretty much worthless without it. So this concept of what natural resources are, of what natural capital is, exists for a long time. But I want to jump forward to a really interesting take on this. It came in 1958 from the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who's just absolutely amazing. And she argues that natural capital is crucial to understanding why we are human beings, why what we are is different. So, there's always this intervention of, what makes us different than animals and all this. It's natural capital for Arendt. She argues that, primitive human beings thousands of years ago, and even today, Aboriginal cultures that do not take advantage of natural capital in the sense of bringing it into the world, modifying it, turning oil into gasoline, turning stone into pyramids and all. When you don't do that, when you're just caught up in what she calls the metabolism of nature, we haven't reached our destiny of actually being human beings. It's only when we jump and we start seeing these things as something that we can act upon and bring them into the world, and they become something more. And what she does, and I'm going to, so the first category, animal labor, as she calls it, Latin for laboring animal, that's what we are. When we become something more, when we become human, it's not because we are Homo sapiens or Homo erectus, but we become, in her terms, which is borrowing from the 18th century, Homo faber, human beings, the maker. And what we make is always made out of natural resources, these valueless things that we bring into our world. Her perspective, I think, is really interesting at the moment it comes around in 58, because it's going to sort of lay out a distinction that will play out environmentally in the next couple of decades. She argues these two ways. I'm going to quote from her. She has a wonderful book talking about the human condition called The Human Condition. And I'm quoting from it here. Nature seen through the eyes of animal laborers is a provider of all good things, which belong equally to all her children, who take them out of her hands and mix with them in labor and consumption. It's a very beautiful model of how we existed at one point at harmony with nature. The interesting thing is what's coming next, she is actually going to champion. The same nature seen in our terms as natural capital through the eyes and ears of Homo faber, the builder of the world, furnishes, and she's quoting Locke here, only the almost worthless materials as in themselves whose whole value lies in the work performed upon them. She goes on to argue that Homo faber always acts violently towards nature, and her quote here is great. This element of violence and violation is present in all fabrication. And Homo faber, that's us by the way, the creator of human artifice, has always been a destroyer of nature. She sees this relation, the acting upon nature, as always doing that. So 4 years after this was published, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, arguably, the big milestone work that sets off the modern environmental movement as we know it, probably more than any other work for sure. And a range of people coming from my side of the fence, philosophy, art, people like the poet Gary Snyder, people like the philosopher Arnie Hayes, and this sort of what's called a deep ecology movement that they founded, parallels what we've been talking about here, this sort of the scientific approach looking at scientific, economic, socioeconomic, and these folks begin to take this dichotomy, this binary structure that Arendt identified, and argued that this is exactly the way it works, but not in a positive sense with Arendt. So when we do not take up natural capital and act upon it and build worlds out of it and commit violence to it, we are doing the best possible. This is the best possible way that we can form an environmental ethic. You see the problem though, right away. I mean, there are these two things that are happening at the same time. As a cultural movement, this is being played out simultaneously with EPA being founded, Clean Water, Clean Air Act, and all that at the same time. And this sort of, locks horns with how we have to think about natural capital. The reason I bring it up here in terms of this context, I would argue that sets the stage for seeing natural capital, seeing the things of the earth, not as this sort of gift that comes to animal laborers, but rather this mere stuff that is worthless. When you come about it from that approach, it really makes you, I would argue, skeptical of natural capital for that reason. I think, my own 2 cents on it, that's a problem. I mean, I do not think we should be skeptical of natural capital. But I think that there is a knee-jerk response to it coming from the humanities for that very reason. And I think that it persists very much in the 21st century. We see it in the 1990s. People like Dave Foreman, who's the founder of a group called Earth First, who actually starts talking about why we need the voluntary extinction of the human species, because Homo faber is always going to do violence to the earth. And it just seems like such an extreme position, but surprisingly, so many people that I talk to want to know when things went wrong, when things became a problem, how can we go back to a state prior to all of this. But it doesn't quite seem that can actually happen. And thinking in terms of natural capital, it seems very instrumental in looking forward rather than backwards.
Check 1, 2, okay. Thank you for preparing the ground so nicely for me, Ken. Okay, hello, thank you all for coming.
Closer.
Closer to the microphone. Right. Also, thank you to my fellow panelists, and especially to Elizabeth for framing the question for us so precisely today. This is how she put it. How is the idea of natural capital shaping our relations to the environment? And that phrasing is very important because, in fact, there is no such thing as natural capital. There is only this idea, or rather, this ideology. As Marx wrote in the Grundrisse long ago, paraphrasing now, there is no such thing as production in general, only all of the particular historically unique, actually working forms of production, right? Similarly, there is no such thing as natural capital, only every particular and describable instance in which human attention directed at the object world valorizes, attaches value, finds value in, for example, a forest, a river, a watershed, or what folks are now calling ecosystem services. For example, the ability of a valley in Zimbabwe to sequester carbon into the future. If they can figure out a way to measure and account for that service, and they can attach a money value to it, why then they can buy and sell that service, a market can be created for that service, and that market can then be shaped and used by various social forces to accomplish or achieve any number of objectives to satisfy any range of desires. So, for example, corporations will use them to do what corporations do, and that is to support profits, and states will use them for social control and reproduction. For example, if they have international obligations under a new greenhouse gas treaty. Individuals and climate change groups will use them for every conceivable nature of political project. So the important thing here is to show that all markets have to be created. They do not simply exist. Historical actors with varying degrees of power collaborate to shape and create them to satisfy their own interests, even when some or all of these interests are felt and presented as collective, common, and public interest. And in fact, every single proponent of challenging on this, of natural capital idea will always do this. This is about sustainability. That's why they're presenting this idea. And so now let's focus on this historicity of markets for a moment, because no matter how much effort we put into elevating our own consciousness of it, what is given to the senses in the present and assumed as natural by average folks will essentially win the policy debate usually. So there's a difficulty to really be critical about this in a contemporary environment like our own. Let's take the labor market for an example, okay? We take that for granted now, but history reveals that the last thing people wanted to do is sell their labor on the open market competitively. In fact, you have to deprive them of every other option before you can get them to do it. Right? They must have nothing else. They must be deprived of all property and torn from their family relationships and their social relationships to land before they'll do it. Only then will they be free from all those previous encumbrances, and then they'll go to work for you out of necessity because they're hungry. An incredible amount of violence was necessary to build the great labor markets of the 20th century, which are now themselves engines of institutional violence. By which I mean that today billions of people are born into a system in which historically violent accumulation determines their position at the bottom of the labor market. They are born into a system to have their labor alienated and their life energies separated from them, and they are forced to sell their wages. Okay? That's what I mean by institutional violence, structural violence. And so what now lies in store for nature as it is similarly prepared for the market? Markets for nature and ecosystem services require that these previously intangible assets must first be separated from their previous relationships. And what does that mean? New violence, new forms of primitive accumulation, new enclosures. For example, before tradable carbon credits can be produced for climate-smart agricultural projects in the African veldt, new practices of accounting and of land tenure and ownership and tillage, etc., must be agreed upon and instituted. But what about the old ways of doing those things? They must be left behind. And that is and will always be an intensely contested process. For force must be used, loans, bribes, and ultimately violence, because people hold on to what they have built, no matter even if what they have built is not ideal, right? At least it's theirs. And now it's busy season in South America and in the global South in general on environmentalists who are killed 1, 2, 3 per week now, right? Fighting the mines and the dams and the roads and the loggers in the global South, right? They are opposing corporations who, in every case, unequivocally, in their mission statements, are there to represent sustainable development. Just go on the internet, find one of these corporations, go to there, find out what their mission statement says. They are here for sustainable development. That's their mission. Okay. Now, I want to give you a quote from Peter Baker, president of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature at their recent, no, he's the president of the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, and that's, he's speaking now at the World Congress of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in 2012. Wow. Sorry about that, but I'm going to be citing Mr. Baker from Peter Sullivan. Who cited Peter Sullivan earlier, The Myth of okay, so I'm citing from this paper, The Myth of Natural Capital, which I can't recommend more highly to this crowd. Okay, quote. I'm from business. That means, and I apologize, I'm a capitalist. But let me explain to you what capitalist is, what a capitalist is. A capitalist is somebody who optimizes returns from capital. The mistake we've made in our economic model is that capitalists only optimize returns from financial capital. What we need to do is we need two more elements of capital, natural capital and social capital, and tell the capitalists to go and optimize that. And that's going to be the way forward. Okay, this is from the paper by Sean Sullivan, The Natural Capital Myth, and his next line in the essay goes as follows. Capitalism, however, is a particular ideological paradigm associated with persistent and deepening inequality between rich and poor, as well as with the various apocalyptic environmental changes and scenarios now associated with the Anthropocene, unquote. Okay, here's the point. Baker's application of the economic rationale is representative. It is precisely the thought you see guiding everyone at the UN climate talks when they start talking about using market mechanisms to put a price on carbon. This idea is omnipresent. It is that markets allocate resources efficiently. That's the illusion. That's the ideology. That's the ahistorical ground of this insurgency of the natural capital idea. Okay? When in fact, we know, on the contrary, that violence must first alienate and separate that which is to be optimized and accumulated from all of its preceding relations. So you see, natural capital assumes what many people that I know in the global climate justice movement, for example, are not ready to let go of without a fight. And that is that we are or should be willing to accept that taking or that separation, right? The type of outcome, imagine the type of outcome that they're being asked to accept, right? The outcomes, for example, in the market for nature as we see meted out in the financial and labor and commodity markets every day? Are they prepared for that? Okay? That unspoken acceptance is the ideological commitment of the natural capitalists. That's what I propose. So again, should we be willing to accept the same kind of inequality in the water and air and wildlife markets that the natural capitalists are trying to build? Are we ready to accept market failures in these new natural capital markets? What would a market failure or a market crash in the air market look like, in the carbon market? How does it play out? Imagine a global crisis in the market for ecosystem services. It happens to every other single market if you take a historical perspective and start with a description of actual markets and not the idea of markets and how great they should be functioning. Okay, in the world system of various capitalisms that we have today, we can see unequivocally that relatively unfettered markets are producing. 1% of the world's population today now owns collectively half of the social wealth of planet Earth, right? And now the leaders and the ideologues of that system are presenting their new idea, natural capital. Well, here's the ruse, right? It's not new. This is the moonshot of business as usual, in my perspective, from my opinion, right? This is the fantasy of the victors that we're witnessing. And the whole debate functions as yet another ideological veil that serves to further blind folks to the truth of the historical struggle and the violence that goes into creating these markets. And these struggles are ongoing now, for example, in Brazil, where the Movimento Sem Terra and La Via Campesina fight against the Red Plus program projects that are right now subsuming their way of life. Their place in this world would be incorporated into these new regimes of accounting. The Natural Capital Program, for example, of the United Nations Environment Program, is attempting to institute and is instituting. Okay, shouldn't probably continue the rest of this, but I'm going to go a couple more minutes. Let me close on a positive note then. If I'm right, the 21st century really does become the century of natural capitalism, we should soon witness the same scale of socialization in the environmental sphere as we saw in the 20th century financial sphere. And I mean by this the socialization of the scale of social struggles, right? What will be the correlate of the labor movement in this new century? And remember how capitalism responded to the success of that movement. I mean the way capital globalized to shore up profits by going to cheap labor in China and in India and South America in general. Okay, is everybody familiar with the IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization programs of the late 20th century that subjected impoverished nations and peoples to debt-leveraged structural adjustment programs? Right, you know this term, structural adjustment programs? The so-called SAPs, in which money was loaned to struggling developing nations on the condition that they open their markets and cut back on state spending and education and health care, essentially neoliberalizing their economies. Well, how did that turn out? Right? Read Mike Davis's 2005 book, Planet of Slums, for a detailed account of what those SAPs produced. Right? The answer to the question is in the title of the book, Planet of Slums. All right? It's an important history to learn because now we are entering the age of natural capital and carbon trading, and these programs will essentially be offered voluntarily, of course, in the beginning, I predict, as environmental adjustment programs. They don't exist now, but people are talking about them in the climate talks. Sure, you can access UN climate mitigation and adaptation funds, no problem. We've assembled them here on a global scale for your benefit. And here's a list of things that you can do in your economy and in your society, in your forestry and mining and dam building regulations in order to qualify for these loans, right? So that's what we're looking at right now. Nations up against rising seas will submit to the terms, these terms. And the new eco bonds and carbon credits will turn their environments into collateral for debt, and all of this to the effect, and all of this to effect a great set of offsets for the great consuming cultures of the global north. Okay, now I have a whole, now I go into the evidence of that. That people
was the upbeat
Okay, hold on.
That's the upbeat part. Yeah. The upbeat part there, in case you missed it, is that the scale of the struggle is going to, I think, rise up and answer that. And we have, I think, the evidence of that in the global climate justice movement, for example. So we have to come away from Santa Barbara, get into the places where the real communities are struggling with not the idea of natural capital or the UNEP REDD Plus programs that are being promoted there and financed by global capital. But the people who come from those communities to these events, for example, I can speak to them directly, and I have, that they tell you what's actually happening. That's what I mean. So that's the upbeat part, is that, that this is a struggle. It will be an outcome of struggle. It will not be an outcome, a direct unfolding of the idea of natural capital as put forth by the United Nations Environment Program, which, by the way, you can't do enough reading on this stuff, but has anybody read the Natural Capital Roadmap? Okay? They're building the institutional foundations of a permanent regime of environmental governance, global environmental governance, in the same way that they started in 1950 building the regime of financial governance, which we all take for granted now, the IMF, World Bank, WTO trade regime, which, well, do your own research on that. It's, and just check your bank account. Its performance is transparent. I'll stop.
Okay. So Rich has started us down this, conversation that this is where we were going to end up sooner or later, but, starting by thinking about what are the premises and concepts implicit in the phrase natural capital and how are they reshaping our relations to our environment. Here's some practical test cases that you are familiar with. I guess one question I think we could ask at this point is, if we engage with the concept of natural capital, are we necessarily committed to buying the whole ball of wax? And I guess Richard's saying that we are, and I've heard other panelists saying that in fact we can manage our engagement with this concept, we can use it as a tool, we can distance ourselves from the parts where we don't like, right, against this argument that in fact it's going to imply and carry with it a kind of ineluctable model of maximization of profits and of orientation towards complete consumption and exploitation and extraction. So, comments on this?
What? Rephrase the question.
Rephrase the question. Okay, so I began by suggesting that natural capital is a metaphor, right? And that it can be managed in certain ways, but that metaphors carry with them the problem or the possibility of our becoming kind of immersed in the metaphor as it's set up and our inability to then resist it or think outside it. The examples I gave were the ways in which people are thinking about nature as natural capital, and then that becomes a language that begins to subsume the concept of nature such that we can no longer think outside of it, right? And that's sort of the sensation I was getting as Richard was speaking. So can I ask people to comment on this notion of whether there's an outside to the concept of natural capital, or whether we can, as Sarah suggested, use it as a tool, pick it up, put it down, put it back in the toolbox.
Let me just say that just returned from Lima, COP20, the United Nations climate talks. The idea of natural capital is not discussed openly in those terms. I mean, you hear it come across in the people, but the United Nations discourse itself does not use this term very much. It's not in the new treaty, for example. But it's omnipresent that this is a huge crisis and that some way of valuing these resources must take place, right? So don't get me wrong. Obviously, the idea behind natural capitalism is so deep in environmental economics for all the decades, and even prior, all the way back to Locke, who knew? But the struggle is to find some way to valorize these resources and protect them. And so I just want to say that struggle, it's an open struggle for what these terms actually mean. The metaphor is not closed yet. Right? It's in the UN climate talks, which might be the most important, I think, venue for the concept.
So let me ask a question, actually, and ask it to everyone else too. So coming at it from the perspective of the arts and humanities, there are people who are going to have a knee-jerk response to this. It's going to be seen as sort of commodification of nature, the whole thing, the locking, the sort of violence and all. What about that? Because I mean, in a way, I mean that, I've actually had a lot of problems with that myself, that sort of attitude, but in a way that's how it got us here environmentally. Modern environmental movement, I mean, started coming out of the 19th century, really valued nature in an entirely different aesthetic way. Bring this into the marketplace is going to, for a lot of people, just seem like a repellent idea. Thoughts on that? I mean, I think that has to be overcome, but that seems like an entirely different sort of issue than the sort of practical, socioeconomic, and all that thing.
Can I just ask, why do you call it knee-jerk?
Say that again, John?
Why do you use the word knee-jerk for that?
Because I think, actually, it's a great question, because I think what we've gotten in the last 50 years of environmental thinking is, in a way, just that. Nature is valuable, it has to be protected, it has to be preserved. That seems to be, I mean, if you were just going to give a quick, sort of synopsis of it for people on the street, then turning around and saying, well, yes, but this is a commodity like any other, or commodity unlike any other that we have to think of in terms of, the capitalist model, is for a lot of folks, I think, going to be problematic. Thoughts?
Well, if you don't mind.
I was kind of putting it
I think a lot of the reaction to the idea is not knee-jerk at all, but based on the fact that it's a clear understanding that you're converting public values into private values. That is unspoken. I mean, it's sort of like, it's like a doxic response from our society, right? To loan money to South American communities who are struggling so that to protect their environment from essentially offsetting your consumption habits in the global north, right? And then in the future, holding those assets from being used because they've already been committed for this other, right? So the issuing of green bonds is essentially by state apparatuses and by institutions And by the way, the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative was launched at 2002 Rio Plus 20 by 40 CEOs of the great financial institutions who were there, of course, to champion sustainable development.
2012.
2000, what'd I say?
22.
Yeah, I meant 2000. Right? So I think there's a long history here. It's not necessarily, I mean, there may be some knee-jerk reaction, but a lot of it is a coherent study